So about the webinar, as the title suggests, we're going to be looking at best practice around reporting and managing sustainability performance across supply chains and projects. I lead a reporting and performance management tool for action sustainability that we've implemented with major UK and global infrastructure, construction and facilities management clients. I'll therefore be sharing sort of some of that experience, and perhaps the frameworks and the advice that I'll be provided is tainted from the view of these industries. However, I'm sure that a lot of the things I say will be applicable to other industries. By the end of this webinar, hopefully I'd have provided you with a definition of what is performance management, what is reporting, what the key benefits are of that, as well as some challenges that we've experienced to date. And finally, I'll be providing a framework with basic principles for managing performance effectively. The content is relatively generic, but it stems from experience by implementing reporting and performance management procedures across projects of organizations, as well as across their supply chains. The way that we'll break down the webinar is, first of all, looking at the what. What are we talking about? What is sustainability performance management? What fits within its scope? Why? So why are businesses engaging, and why is it becoming a much more popular item on the agenda of sustainability? And finally, we'll look at that framework that I mentioned of how do we do it, how do we implement it effectively. So the what. Managing performance is actually a pretty broad subject, and depending on your organization, you might see it from different perspectives. The way we like to frame it is in 4 key steps that are all complementary of each other and all constitute performance management. The first key step is the planning, the intention part, and that's part and parcel of managing performance. If you haven't planned properly, if you haven't laid out your intention, then you won't be able to manage performance effectively. This actually reflects some of the guidance that's provided by ISO 2400 around managing sustainability within your supply chain, which I encourage you to look at online. The planning phase really constitutes making sure that as an organization, whether it's looking at a project or your supply chain, that you've defined what it is you're trying to get out of managing your performance. So essentially, why are you doing it? What are your audacious goals around managing performance? And that's laying out the intention. The second phase is around measuring. It's the collection of information. Typically, it's data, right, that's reported by various entities, whether it's individuals within your organization, business units, or it could be suppliers that are reporting. And that's where you're collecting the information, the hard empirical evidence that you need to manage performance effectively. The third step is reporting, the redaction stage. Typically, that's in the shape of taking a snapshot at a singular time of the data that you've collected, and that tends to have an analysis part that's associated with it. And then finally, once you've done all those 3 steps, you've defined what you want to do, you've collected the data, you've redacted it, made it into digestible format, you can then take action, right? And that 4th step is actually managing the progress, and that's a bit more of a hands-on part of the process for many organizations, particularly when you're working with your supply chain, who will be doing steps 2 and 3 for you potentially. We think that all these 4 things need to be together for effective performance management. However, some organizations might be at different stages of their evolution in terms of where they're at with managing performance, and so maybe only doing a couple of those. To sort of frame as well the conversation, I like to think that managing sustainability performance and reporting is applicable across the board, right? Just in terms of sustainability. So just to clarify, we're taking that 3 pillars approach of sustainability, where we have the environment, the social aspects, and the economic aspects that are combined. we're seeing, particularly in our experience, that organizations are asking their projects or their supply chains to report sustainability under a really large umbrella of issues. We can see on the right-hand side of the screen there, a word cloud of various sustainability issues that might be reported. What we're seeing in terms of the most, I guess, popular areas of reporting and performance management, obviously one being carbon, because organizations are trying to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. We're seeing reporting against health and safety. Health and safety and waste, actually, they've been, I guess, more widely reported against for some time now because of regulation, because governments around the world have enforced that type of information to be reported for obvious reasons. Other areas with well-being being in an agenda of sustainability that's coming up a lot in terms of popularity. We're seeing more and more data being reported around employees and organizations sort of taking active steps to manage how well they treat their employees and the happiness levels of their employees, and therefore they're collecting empirical evidence against that. If we look at ISO 2400 perspective, there are more and more organizations as well that are now reporting against their procurement practices and the performance of their procurement, because they see that as underpinning the rest of their sustainability agenda throughout their supply chain. Obviously, there are other areas of sustainability that are commonly reported against, and we'll see that sort of across the board, across industries. Water, materials used, biodiversity levels, etc. These are all types of issues that fall under sustainability that are being reported against. One last interesting one that I wanted to mention is social value. Now, this is an interesting trend that we're seeing in the UK, whereby organizations are reporting some of their community-based efforts and employee-based efforts, and they're monetizing that under a framework for social value, whereby they're monetizing the impacts that their activities are having on the community. And no doubt that monetization piece is something that we're going to see, increase as a trend throughout the world as organizations trying to align their sustainability performance management with triple bottom line approaches or other such like frameworks. What I just described there is sort of in terms of an organization, what constitutes performance management. Very briefly, I'll go into more detail afterwards. And also it's, what falls under its umbrella in terms of sustainability issues. The other way we can look at it as well is, well, where do we manage sustainability, and where is reporting happening across organizations in our supply chain? First of all, there's an increasing amount of reporting and performance management that's happening at corporate levels. In its most popular formats, we're seeing more and more organizations, initially large organizations, but even medium-sized organizations doing so now, and they're publishing annual sustainability reports in parallel to their financial reports that might be making publicly available. Obviously, there's a part of communication that's around that, but a lot of it is also to do with making sure that you're keeping your stakeholders informed and keeping yourselves as organizations accountable against some targets that you might have set around sustainability. Organizations, when they do this, they typically report them on an annual basis, and then some of them will also align these reports and align some of the data that they're publicly publishing with key frameworks that are in use across the world. Examples of two popular ones there, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So many organizations, particularly the large ones, will align goals against the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and they'll publish annual reports that really are showing and benchmarking how well they're doing against those goals. There are other frameworks. There's the UN PRIs, Principles for Responsible Investments, the UN Global Reporting Initiative, etc. The list goes on. There are many indices. We'll see sort of investor indices that are specific to various industries, and organizations are reporting against those because that attracts investors and enables them to access certain investment channels. And also sometimes they're under regulation they're obliged to report against those. If we step down from a corporate level that, as I've said, is typically reported on an annual basis, we're also seeing organizations that are reporting against specific projects. This I've seen in the construction industry quite a lot, in infrastructure industry quite a lot. Really, the reporting there tends to happen. There's reporting that happens before and reporting that happens after. So it's sort of a before snapshot and an after snapshot to try and sort of show the difference that a project has made on the environment or the community at large. Often, some of these projects are reporting because of permit requirements. There might be the local authorities are imposing these as part of permits for construction or for accessing a market, etc. And then we also see that quite often, projects are aligned to certain certifications, and they're trying to sort of get that stamp. And part of getting that stamp is reporting and managing your performance. Finally, if we sort of go down a further level, we're seeing that organizations are managing their performance and reporting across their supply chains. That can take sort of various shapes and forms. The most popular one, and the one that we recommend, is frequent reporting. If you're asking your supply chain to provide their information, their sustainability information to you based on the activities that they're doing for you as an organization, we recommend that is frequent reporting, maybe monthly or biannually. There are also annual audits that constitute performance management. And finally, why is this occurring? Well, more often than not, the end client will have that as a contractual obligation, that they want sustainability data to be reported from downstream, upstream. So, what are we seeing in terms of reporting performance management and what's coming up the agenda? This is wholly linked to sustainability as a whole coming up the agenda for society at large. Obviously, with problems around where we're getting our energy from and energy sources, issues with pollution that we're seeing around the world, whether it's air quality pollution or water pollution, scarcity of water, scarcity of food in certain parts of the world, the reduction in raw materials that we have available to us, the reduction of biodiversity around the world, making sure that our employees are motivated and happy, the continued social inequality that we're seeing in our communities. The list will go on. I'm sure you're familiar with the sustainability issues that the world is facing, but obviously all of those are driving sustainability as an agenda in the business world, and therefore they're sort of the major drivers behind making organizations think and try to address their sustainability performance. One key thing that we're seeing is that in the public eye, companies are held accountable more than ever before for their impact on the environment or on society. And society sees organizations as powerful institutions with a role to play, which is why they're holding them accountable. Consumers and people are holding companies accountable. This is a key driving trend that's making organizations report and sort of publicly disclose their sustainability performance. The second reason is that we see as key to this is business decision makers are feeling that responsibility as well, and they're taking sustainability issues more profoundly than ever before, arguably. And as a result, they're seeing that they have a civic duty to ensure that their organizations operate sustainably, and therefore they're pushing down those obligations into their supply chains. Today, with extremely connected, whether it's mainly driven by the internet, but there are other technologies that have enabled us to collect data in a way that we were never able to do before. And as a result, some of the reporting and performance management that we're seeing is now becoming very detailed, and that's something that we weren't able to do before. So technology is definitely an enabler in sustainability and performance management. We're seeing that managing risks is key to why organizations want to manage their sustainability performance. I'm not making specific reference to COVID-19 here, but as the world evolves and as we see certain crises unfolding, we're seeing that particularly supply chains are quite vulnerable, and therefore trying to take a proactive stance on that is helping organizations be more resilient. And one key way of doing that is of taking that active stance is by trying to initially report, understand your information, and manage it upfront early on before before disasters actually occur. We're also seeing that there are, micro and macro trends that are occurring. If we take the example of plastics, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the fact that until a few years ago, plastics wasn't necessarily that high in terms of a public agenda for sustainability. There's been a documentary by David Attenborough, and as a result, we saw in the last couple of years many organizations take action against the plastic waste that they were generating, and they're publicly disclosing that information and really publicizing it. So that's an example of a macro trend. It's happened all over the world, where organizations are trying to eliminate their single-use plastics and microplastics waste. And then finally, we're seeing more and more regulatory compliance that's making organizations have to report on sustainability, and they have to manage their performance. In the EU, since 2016, large companies have to disclose non-financial and diversity information. At the UN Conference of Sustainable Development in Rio +20, there was a key emphasis on reporting. And therefore, I mean, there's lots of examples of that, but essentially we're seeing jurisdictions around the world, governments around the world, really pushing reporting up the agenda, and they're seeing that as part and parcel of managing our sustainability impacts as organizations and as society. So that's sort of framing a little bit of the sustainability performance management, what it is and what's driving it. Now I just want to explore sort of why, from an organization's perspective, would you want to manage your sustainability performance and across your own activities in your supply chain. We did with our clients some research and saw that these were 4 key aspects that are driving them to do this. First of all, there's value creation. Written some pointers there around reputation and competitive differentiation. Again, that's applicable to why would you want to be a more sustainable business. What we're observing is that there's more and more of an emphasis in tenders and in winning business. There's more and more of an emphasis on sustainability criteria. So, is the business I'm buying from sustainable, and are they trying to do their best? And those typically are the businesses that are winning market share. There are reports around investors that are saying that the businesses that are more sustainable, that score higher on sustainability indices, outperform the others financially. So it definitely seems that there's a parallel there between how well you're managing your sustainability performance and the value that your organization creates. I discussed it earlier on. There's the risk management aspect of making sure that your business is resilient, and that's seen as really a key issue. There's efficiency gains that can be made through effective performance management. If I take my experiences in working with construction and infrastructure markets, industries, sorry, we can definitely see that as organizations, report on their energy, they're becoming more aware of their energy consumption, and therefore they become aware of hotspots of energy consumption, and as a result, they know where they can reduce, and that's leading to cost efficiencies. So there's definitely there's a perception often that sustainability is costly and that it has to be an extra effort that's going to impact your bottom line, but actually, well, negatively, but actually, the reality is that there are many things that you can do to reduce your costs and to positively impact your business bottom line. The only thing that underpins that is making sure that you know what your baseline is and understanding where your inefficiencies exist. So without reporting, you're unable to do that. And finally, we're also seeing that organizations want to be innovative. They want to take a proactive approach to sustainability and to reporting, because they want to find new ways of doing business, new ways of engaging with their supply chains, and that leads to innovation. And ultimately, that sort of links back to value creation. In terms of reporting and performance management, there are three key obstacles that we observe here through our clients. First of all is a lack of understanding. So there's a lack of understanding that reporting is the baseline to your sustainability strategy. As I said before, if you want to prove efficiency gains or identify areas for where there are potential efficiency gains, you need to start by reporting, collecting information. And there's a lack of understanding of that in the market. And when we're looking at managing performance across supply chains, we're very often seeing that the clients have an understanding, they're trying to push that, but then lower down the supply chain, tier 1, tier 2, and so on, don't necessarily have an understanding of what sustainability is and the benefits that it can provide. And as a result, they don't have an understanding of why they need to report data and provide information for effective performance management. This is creating a lack of engagement. And we can visibly see that in some organizations, the culture is that profits go first, and that sustainability is way down the pecking order, and that's creating a lack of engagement. And there are many things that are stopping that. It can be from the management level, who aren't engaged in sustainability and therefore not pushing that agenda throughout their organization, down to the individuals who simply have other priorities because they're assessed on different criteria on their day-to-day jobs, and as a result, they're not engaging. This is a major barrier to effective performance management, because when we can't get the individuals with boots on the ground to report the data or take the action that's needed to take, then we're struggling to make the changes that are needed to address the sustainability issues that we're facing. And then one last key barrier is the lack of standardization. And this applies really to reporting, whereby I don't know an industry where there is widespread standardization of what's being reported and how organizations are managing their performance. And that's holding us back as a global community. What we can see is that organizations, some do align to standards that exist, but it's still not widespread enough. And by that, I mean, really simple things like, how do we measure our carbon? And that is done in multitudes of ways by organizations around the world, and even by organizations within the same industry in the same country. We can see that in the UK in construction, and we're trying to do some work on that. The power of standardization is that it would make reporting so much easier for everyone. You would provide clarity, and people would be used to reporting in a standard format. So it would create massive efficiencies, and as a result, we'd also be able to compare apples for apples rather than apples and oranges, which are very difficult to compare. So lack of standardization is really a key thing. So the how, I just want to move into a framework for trying to address some of these issues and unlocking some of those benefits or those drivers that I presented earlier on. The framework that we propose to our clients is a plan, do, check, act, aligned framework. And as you can see in the middle there, I've aligned that to the intention, collection, redaction, and action framework that I proposed earlier on. But step one to effective performance management is planning, and that's writing down your intention and knowing how you're going to set about doing so. It starts off with aligning your performance management with your sustainability strategy. That is identified with your key stakeholders, and what you have to do there is limit the scope in terms of what you want to address. You're not going to be able to address and tackle all the issues in the world, so try and limit to the ones where you're going to have the most impact and potential for impact. Once you know what your strategy is, then define what your goals are and identify what it is that you want to identify, to measure, manage, and report. I'll break that down a little bit in a couple of slides, but essentially this is understanding, well, as an organization, let's say we've decided that we want to make sure that we have the least impact on climate change as possible. Well, what is our goal? What does our goal look like? It could be that we want to become carbon neutral by 2030, for an example. Once you've done that, you can then start thinking about, well, how are we going to know, how are we going to measure if we're carbon neutral by 2030 or not? And that's understanding, well, what pieces of information do we need to gather, who do we need to gather it from, etc., and at what frequency. So those are things that are listed there next to the plan, the quarter of the pie there. One key thing there is really understanding the tools that you're going to be using as well to help you do that. In the examples that I provided at the beginning, I mentioned that organizations are reporting at a corporate level. They're typically reporting on an annual basis. They'll be submitting sort of PDF brochures, right, online to promote that, etc. If it's a project or the supply chain, there tends to be sort of project specific or supply chain specific data that's being fed up into that. All of that nowadays, we're seeing the vast majority is reported in spreadsheets, and that's probably not the best technology. So we really advise our clients to explore the various tools that are available based on what their objectives are, how they want to report, what tools are available to make sure that happens in sort of the least prone way and the most efficient way as possible, so that it's not a cumbersome process. Once you moved on from your planning phase, you can go to the do, which is the collection in terms of performance management. It's collection of data. So that's where, what we would commonly say is reporting, right, for some organizations. If it's in your supply chain, then what you've done in step one is you've identified which of your suppliers need to report what information. And then in this step, you get them to provide that information and make sure they submit it. We really recommend when you do that you make sure that there's really a clear standard process for them to do so, and that what they need to report is very, very simple, very clear, and that restrict what they need to report to those initial objectives that you have. If they're reporting something that falls outside one of your objectives, let's say you've got no objectives against reducing your water consumption for whatever reason, don't ask your suppliers, your supply chain, or your project stakeholders to report on water, because then you can easily fall into the trap of asking for as much data as possible, but then you can sort of suffocate with too much data. So we try and suggest a lean approach at this phase of just collecting the information that you need. There's a purpose to everything that that is being recorded for you as an organization. The next phase is the check, the redaction part, and That's really analyzing the information that you receive from your reporting, and trying to see, well, what conclusions can you make of that? And that's really an analysis piece. Very often it's conducted by consultants or by individuals with expertise in specific issue areas, whether it be in energy, etc. And once you've done all of that, you've collected the data, you've analyzed it, then that's when you can go into the management phase of reporting and performance management, which is, well, trying to identify risk areas, right, where you're not doing so well, and try to address some of the issues that you're identifying. If you're doing this whole process efficiently, you should be able to do that act really early on. What I mean by that is, let's take a 2-year project. If you've clearly defined at the beginning your planning before the project starts, then there is reporting that's occurring, that collection phase. Let's say, if it's a 2-year project, you should probably be asking your supply chain to report at least quarterly, if not monthly. If they're reporting monthly, you can tell after month 1 whether you're on the way to hit your targets for the 2-year project or not. And if you're not, you can take action from month 1 immediately, which means that you're not waiting for the end of a project to take action, to analyze all the data and to realize that we missed our targets here. From month 1, you can analyze your information and see whether you're on course to hitting your targets or not. If you're not, you take action. A few sort of key tips that we propose to our clients. One is determine your baseline. Whenever you're trying to manage your sustainability performance, data is key, and therefore try to understand, where do you stand today? So then you can know whether you're having a real impact or not. Too often we're seeing organizations committing to sustainability objectives without really understanding where they're at today. And they commit to them, they publicly commit to these sustainability objectives, and then they're not able to meet them for whatever reason. Had they had their baseline, they would have probably been able to sort of offer more realistic sustainability objectives. Second, I've mentioned it a few times already, is establishing reporting frequency. This will be determined by the context of your project. If it's a 2-year project, let's say, then you might want to do so every month, etc. When you're managing your supply chain, we really encourage you to keep sort of very close tabs on your suppliers. The more frequently you ask them to report, the more accountable they will become for the actions and the impact that they're having, and also the more you'll have an opportunity to address some potential issues that you identify. Obviously, reporting too frequently can become a hindrance as well and can become quite costly. So you need to balance those things out. I've mentioned exploring tools and resources to support the process. Make sure that you've got that you've explored all the existing tools that are out there. We've seen spreadsheets being used too many times, and spreadsheets are sort of relatively inefficient ways of reporting data up to, getting data reported from your supply chains and vice versa. And try and implement tools that sort of minimize human error, because that can cause quite a lot of issues when you're trying to manage your performance and the data you're collecting is wrongly input. One way of managing that risk is through audits, through regular audits of your suppliers or your project workers. Depending on the context of a project, the frequency will need to be determined as well, and how do you identify which parts of your supply chain to audit. We really recommend that you undergo sort of risk analysis, right, to try and identify hotspots for potential risk areas and audit those in terms of priority. Defining your stakeholders is really important. That's extremely important when you're working with your supply chain, because you need to understand who it is that you're trying to have a positive impact with, and think how many tiers down the supply chain you want to go down, and you sort of want to put pressure on, and you want to push that sustainability accountability onto. Likewise, also think about the stakeholders that are going to be looking at the information that you'll be disclosing potentially. If it's investors or if it's the wider, public at large, that will impact how you want to report and what type of data you might want to collect for your performance management. Making reporting contractual is really important in terms of asking your supply chain to report data to enable you to have a full picture of your sustainability impact. We always tell our clients that they should include reporting as sort of as part of a service that they purchase from their suppliers, so that suppliers are sort of legally obligated to report. We've seen very often organizations who commit to sustainability objectives and they ask their supply chain for that information, and the suppliers turn around and say, well, happy to report, but it's going to cost you however much extra because we didn't factor that in our prices. So that contractual requirement is very important. And then finally, but probably most importantly, is using common language. So making sure that everyone is aligned with what information you're trying to obtain and what issue you're trying to address. By that I mean, if I ask or a supplier for their energy consumption, based on the supplier, they might interpret that in a slightly different way and provide different information. Some might provide kilowatt hours from their energy bill, but others might provide a bunch of different information, including their fuel consumption information, etc. So it's really trying to be really specific and making sure that everyone understands what it is you're trying to obtain from them when dealing with your supply chain is very important. And the way we do that with our clients is we get the supplier stakeholders together and we create common definitions that everyone agrees with and understands. Finally, in terms of that common language, also try to think that sometimes the information that you're asking from your supply chain will be reported by someone who's not necessarily competent in the area that we're asking them to report in. So make sure that you're using sort of relatively simple and understandable language, so it doesn't have any technical terms that someone might not understand. Here, this explores that in a little bit more detail, and it goes back to the planning quarter that I was discussing earlier on, and that's where I said that as an organization, when you're looking to manage performance, you first of all need to understand your strategy. And once you've done that, then you can break that down. This is really aligned to the approach that ISO 2400 proposes in their methodology. But it's first of all understanding your goals, right? Your overall aim. We can see in this example I've written, reduce the amount of waste being sent to landfill, and then as a result, from that, you can then start drilling down and go down sort of how you break that up. So from that goal of reducing your waste sent to landfill, you can then set a target that 90% of your waste should be diverted from landfill, right? That's a tangible target that your organization or your supply chain can work against. And as a result, from that, you can develop what's known as an indicator, a KPI, right? So what is the percentage of waste diverted from landfill? And organizations can sort of, that's what they can report against, and then they can measure that indicator performance against the 90% target that's there. To get your indicator, to be able to calculate it, to know how much waste you diverted from landfill, you break that down into metrics, right? And there are two key pieces of information you need to know. First of all, you need to know, well, how much waste did you generate? And then how much of your waste was diverted from landfill, right? Was not sent to landfill. If you've got those two key pieces of information, those two metrics, you can then calculate your indicator and sort of move back up and see whether you're hitting your target, and therefore are you achieving your goal or not. So for every one of your objectives, we recommend that you break them down in this way. This is a simplified version of that. So if you look at the metric piece, then it can become much more complicated, right? Because that's where you then need to start breaking down that metric into, well, the waste? Do I want to know my different types of waste, and is that being reported, and which organizations within my supply chain need to report against that, etc. This is the sort of the simplified framework for that. It's just at the metric level that becomes a little bit more complex in reality. So there we go. I've got a practical example of how to manage your sustainability performance. As I said, I work for Action Sustainability, and we run a sustainability tool with infrastructure, construction, and facilities management organization in the UK. This is an online tool that helps them to manage performance and get their supply chain to report on sustainability information, so that our clients are informed of the correct data to enable them to manage their performance effectively. All of the key principles that are in this presentation have been used to build this tool. And one key thing that I just wanted to point out from it is that in terms of managing performance, when we look at sustainability issues and the goals that organizations set, one key thing that we've developed is a visual indicator of whether organizations, whether our clients using this tool are hitting their targets or not. And here's a screenshot on the left-hand side of a dashboard for a project, where you can see the different sustainability issues that a client wants to have an impact on. So air quality, community, employees, environmental management, ethics, materials, procurement, waste, and water. And what we can see is in green the areas whereby they're hitting their targets, and in red where they're not hitting them. In amber, it's where they're sort of almost hitting their targets, but they're not, so they're risk zones. But really what's key here is that the visual indicator enables our clients to very rapidly identify areas where they're not hitting their targets, and therefore where they need to take action. So there we go. I'd like to thank you all for having listened to this webinar. I don't know if there have been any questions.
Charles, we just have one. Do you have any examples of actual organisations who do measure their sustainability performance well, that you could perhaps give an example of?
Yes,
if possible.
Absolutely, yes. There's one organisation who I would recommend you all look at, and I can send a link to one of their latest sustainability reports, and that is British Land. In the UK, they build and manage sort of real estate here in the UK, and they've got very detailed, they publish annual reports on sustainability, and those are corporate level reports, but you can very well see how they use the project level data and supply chain level data to feed back up into those. I'll send a link to that. One piece that's very interesting is the detail that they go into, and also that they provide definitions of everything that's being reported against and presented in their annual reports. It's very detailed. It use simple language, and then they evidence how they've collected that data. So I'll share that when I share the slides afterwards.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Charles. Also, could I ask if Charles can show some indicators we could use to measure the sustainability in the supply chain?
Yes, I can do. Obviously, it's very broad, and it depends on the context of your industry, the market that you're working in, what your objectives are, etc. What I'm going to do is I'm going to continue to share my screen, but I'm going to share an example from the sustainability tool. Well, you'll see a few examples of KPIs that are being used. By way of examples, and if you use the same sort of logic that we used in developing those, then you should be in a good position. I'll just share another window from my computer. So I'm just showing my web browser here. This is a dummy account in the sustainability tool, which is the reporting performance management software application that I implement with clients in the UK. What we can see here is I'm just showing a reporting interface. So in this instance, we can see at the top here that I'm in a report due page. So I've logged in as a waste contractor working on a Shoreditch project. Shoreditch is an area of London, for those that don't know. And then the client is Hepton Store Conversions. We can quite clearly see that you know, I'm reporting from May the 1st to May the 31st. There's definite clarity in terms of, you know, who I am and where I need to report. I'm a waste contractor, I'm reporting for those correct dates, etc. If we then go down here, we can see the list of information that I'm required to report as that supplier. You know, under carbon, I need to report number of vehicles, etc. And then I can see an I there with that common definition that I was talking about, the unit that the supplier needs to report against, and then the data, and then they can report it and they can add comments as well. So you can see I've started reporting some of this. I'll fill in the next line here, gas or red diesel. I'll put 500 liters and it shows me my carbon emissions, etc. as a result from that. If I submit that as a supplier, it then starts feeding into dashboards, right? Which is where the information is sort of analyzed. Here we can see an example dashboards with a few sustainability issues. And what I'll do is, as I open an issue, we'll then see the KPIs, right? So some of the indicators that we're using to measure how well we're doing against these issues. If I click on employees, we can see a few examples here against employees that organizations might want to use. So to know whether your employees are happy and satisfied and motivated, you're going to need to understand how you measure that as an organization. In this instance, this organization has decided to measure that with three key indicators. So one being percentage of work days lost to sick leave, percentage of BAME staff, so that's Black, African, and minority ethnic staff, and then total number of training in hours. Two of these are in percentages. I would say that percentages are often a very good way of building a KPI, right? Because they're relative. And then one of them isn't. It's absolute. So to know, you know, the total number of training in hours, my employees and my whole project. If I tell you 600 hours, well, you might not know whether that's good or not unless you know the context of that project. So typically we would advise clients to implement sort of relative indicators, relative KPIs, right? So it could be, you know, percentage of training hours by total hours worked, right? So that, you know, if I then tell you, well, it's 0.0001, you might tell me, well, that doesn't seem like a lot of training based on the amount of work that everyone's doing. Well, if I tell you, well, it's 5%, that seems like a much more reasonable number, and it gives you more of that context. Percentage of BAME staff, there to know that you need two metrics. You need to know, you know, what's your total number of staff, and then how many of them are BAME. So you can use the two to calculate that. And then percentage of work days lost to sick leave. Again, that's knowing how many days were worked in total on your project or by individuals in your supply chain, and then how many days were not worked because someone was ill, right? And again, that's a percentage. If I flick over to air quality, this is just by way of example. Here, the client has decided, this is a fictitious project, by the way. So when I say the client, it's a fictitious client. Here for air quality, the client, you know, has decided to ensure that they minimize the pollution on air quality that they're creating. And the KPI that they've decided for that is percentage of vehicles that are for silver accredited. So essentially accredited to a certain standard of emissions. So there we go. So in that instance, they need to know, well, how many of their vehicles are accredited and how many of their vehicles do they have? And that's how they're able to measure that. This is in green, so straight away we know that that client is doing well against air quality. Carbon, there's a mix. We've got one example of an indicator is Scope 1 emissions for the project. I won't go into it too much, but there's 3 different categories for your carbon emissions, and they fall into different scopes. So Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. Scope 1 is any sort of emissions that you that would have been produced on site, like if you're burning a fuel on site, or if you have a company vehicle and you're driving that vehicle and that there's emissions coming out of its exhaust. Scope 2 is for all your energy that you're procuring from the grid, from your electricity provider, and then Scope 3 is everything else. It's really, really broad. It's emissions that go into the travel for your goods and services, from if they're shipped by a logistics provider, or the carbon that's embedded in the materials you purchase, etc. So we can see here we've got these Scope 1 as one indicator, Scope 2 and Scope 3, but then the client would have decided also, we want to know, well, what percentage of our CO2 emissions are from travel, right? Because that might be one of the ways they want to help themselves better manage their carbon impact. We can see here one with all project CO2 emissions, so that would be the addition of Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3, and then CO2 emissions at the end from red diesel usage, because again they might identify that as a hotspot, and they might want to know the absolute values of red diesel usage emissions that they're having.
Just one question here. I noticed on the slide there you have in red at the top left employees, and a question's come through. When you're doing this, are you tracking the labour audits to see whether there's modern slavery or non-payment of the minimum wage rate or any other issues, and to verify employer indicator data on the ground? We're being asked if you have a login for third-party verification or supplies, so they can declare whatever they like. So it's just a clarification, is the top left-hand symbol that says employees in red, are any of those issues included in that area?
Absolutely. So first of all, the dashboard that I'm presenting here is just an example of KPIs that an organization would have selected as appropriate, as relevant for themselves, for their organization, for their suppliers. And therefore they might not have identified modern slavery as a risk that's particularly applicable to them, but it doesn't mean that other organization wouldn't, and therefore that can be included in this type of dashboard, or in these types of reports that you as an organization might want to implement. Yes, typically we with organizations trying to ensure that they're minimizing their exposure to modern slavery risks. There are KPIs that can be built around that. It depends on your market, again, where you're based. In the UK, the organizations above a certain size have to publish a modern slavery statement, and therefore one sort of efficient way is that we ask suppliers who are working on a project, who are reporting, to identify whether they've published one of those statements or not, right? Because that's the first step in the right direction. So one KPI could be, well, how many of my supply chain has got a modern slavery statement, right, published? So that's sort of showing you their seriousness in relation to that requirement to publish modern slavery statements. It could also be, what percentage of your employees are, full-time employed, or are on part-time contracts, etc. If you're seeing that that number is very low, then that might sort of raise flags for you. And you might think, well, I need to investigate to see, well, they haven't got full-time employees, so how do they have their employees, and what type of contracts do the staff have? And so that's prompting you to investigate, right? So through reporting, you might not necessarily get the final answer that you're looking for, but it will certainly help you to raise flags in high risk areas.
Okay, brilliant. A number of people have come back with the same question. How does Action Sustainability verify the information given by suppliers to make sure that it's reliable?
There are several ways of that can be done. I'll try and answer as generically as possible, so it's not just Action Sustainability that's answering. But first of all, there's audits that can be carried out. So you get third-party organisations to come in and to carry out audits on your supply chain. As I said, we at Action Sustainability, we do provide that service, and when we do, we will sit down with our clients and analyze their supply chain and identify hotspots. We'll do a heat map to identify hotspots for risks, and we'll go and audit those suppliers first, and sort of those specific issues within those suppliers first, whether it's exposure to modern slavery. We'll go in and identify suppliers that employ lots of employees, employs lots of staff on sort of relatively low wage, and we'll go and really sort of investigate what their contracts look like, and the what credentials do their staff have, etc. What are their processes for recruiting new staff, etc. The other thing is data can be provided in several ways. It can be provided by a person, right, who can report data. But also data, thanks to technology, is being recorded automatically by systems. If you've got energy meters or water meters, you've got on many sites, whether it's an office or if it's a construction site or something, employees have swipe cards, right? So you know when they're coming in, when they're coming out, and as a result, and then you've got profiles you've got systems that keep profiles of your employees. So you can, through a system that's just recording this information automatically for you, you can get a number that gives you your percentage of hours worked by BAME staff this month, right? You don't need to record that information. So when you're relying on technology, typically it will become much more accurate, right? The information that you're provided is much more accurate. What we have in our tool is we have an approval process. So whenever data is provided by an organization, a supplier or someone in your projects, there is an individual who is responsible. It's typically a project manager or a site manager who's responsible for going and verifying the data and approving it. So it sort of gives that human element of someone who's got boots on the ground, who can view the data that's being submitted, right, and they can say, yes, we're happy with that. We'll all the data seems to be correct. There are no evident errors, and we'll report it. There are a few things that you can do to avoid data errors and to have that data assurance.
Okay, and there's just one last question, which was just going back to the previous question. Does the system / technology that we're talking about, allow third parties to log in and enter their data that would verify the supplier labour, safety, environment claims, and whether that data comes from tech audits or whatever? Is there a way of that happening?
Yes, third parties can have access to this system. I would encourage that any system that you use for your performance management and your sustainability reporting should enable your supply chain or third party organizations to be able to access it and have a sort of a role within that process of report, approve or review the data, and then analyze the data. In terms of, you know, having evidence documentation, etc., this is completely possible in this system. But whatever system you're using, you must make sure that the appropriate, you know, logs or contracts or you know, any evidence documentation is readily available for you as an organization, because then that makes your audit processes and your verification processes much easier. Finally, there are ways that you can, it sort of comes back to the question before last as well, but there are ways when you receive data that you can see if you've got a sudden sharp increase in one of your indicators, and you know, you can flag that up quite easily, just to ask a human being to go in and verify that data and verify the information that's been reported, because why is there a sudden spike in that information? Sometimes it's expected, it's because a certain activity wasn't happening and suddenly it is, so you're going from 0 to 100 from one month to the next. But yeah, there are definitely ways and processes that you can put in place to make sure you identify those early on, to see whether it's an issue with the data that's being reported, whether it's an issue with the evidence that's being gathered, etc.